Thank you so much, John, for this prestigious award. It is particularly meaningful to receive it in the very first year that I became eligible for it. That year, though, has been one of suffering and tragedy. I myself lost two members of my family to COVID-19, and I'm sure so many people in the software freedom community have faced similar suffering and anguish. So it's with a heavy heart that I accept being a fan of award shows, that I can't run up on stage in front of all of you and hold the award up high and do it all in person. We all have an obligation, as every citizen does, to avoid crowds and do all the things that are necessary to assure this pandemic comes to a swift end. So I accept this award remotely instead and look forward to seeing you all again in future at some point. I have so many people that I must thank for this award. I'll be reaching out to many of them over the coming weeks, and I hope they'll forgive me that I picked just a few to thank here today. I'm a fan of the Kierkegaard quote, "Life must be lived forwards, but can only be understood backwards." I therefore tend to look backwards to understand the events of the day. And when I learned I was receiving this award, I looked at the past winners and was reminded the inaugural winner of this award was Larry Wall. Larry created Perl and the Perl community in the early 1990s, and that was the first free software community that I ever participated in. I thank everyone in that community, and Larry in particular, for teaching me how valuable free software collaboration was and how much it could accomplish. And most of all, that choosing a good license for a free software project was essential to making it accessible and usable and preserving the freedoms of everyone. Years later, in the early 2000s, Larry served on my thesis committee, and I was about to go off to my first job as a software freedom activist. In those days, one of the key points of debate was the question of how to handle people who used less than good language to refer to our work in free software. Larry had a great piece of advice for this particular linguistic conundrum. He said, "I think as an activist, you should follow the rule of network protocols on this language issue. Namely," he said, "be conservative in what you emit, but liberal in what you accept." I hope I have followed that rule throughout my career. I've certainly tried to. Second, I want to thank Loïc Dacary. He won't be surprised to know I still haven't learned enough French to pronounce his name correctly, but he may be surprised to know that I was listening to the many things that he taught me about running free software projects. Most notably, I've tried to follow his first principle, which is one of pure stubbornness. He said that the most important thing to do as a free software developer is simply stubbornly refuse to write or use any proprietary software. His thesis being that many of the more complicated decisions that come later will be simpler if this is your first principle. Time in my career have proved that right to me. I've also looked for principles in the history of activism, and a perennial one that I believe we should use and has been used for generations of activists is to always be ready to speak truth to power. This has come easy to me when speaking truth to the incumbent proprietary software power that's all around us in the software industry, but has been exceedingly difficult to do when I've had to speak truth to power to other free software leaders when they needed to hear it. I'm proud that I was able to do it when necessary, and I encourage all of you to speak truth to power no matter where it is, including to me. Software freedom activism was almost a foregone conclusion for me as my career. I loved programming and computers and computer science, but I also really wanted to be a rabble-rouser for a living. So software freedom advocacy and activism was natural. But I care deeply about so many causes and so many important causes in our world today. Systemic racism and sexism are rampant in our world and in our community in particular. Climate change remains a seemingly intractable problem that needs our attention. I believe that software freedom activism should take an intersectional approach and engage with these other causes, learn how to implement their ideals in our movement, and teach them our ideals and encourage them to be implemented in their movements. As the world becomes more digital, software freedom becomes a key center cause of all the many important causes we need to take on. And we have to be opening and coordinating with these other causes. That brings me to the person who taught me that principle. My friend, my colleague, my collaborator, co-host of a podcast with me, Karen Sandler. Karen and I believe, have proved the old adage, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. We have achieved together things in free software that I am sure neither of us could have achieved had we attempted them on our own. Software freedom activism is a cause where the highs are very high and the lows are very low. Having someone working with you every day who cares just as deeply as you do about the cause is a comfort and a joy. Finally, and most importantly, I thank my spouse, Elizabeth McKeever. Elizabeth has been with me since the first day I read the GPL and has stood by me and been my friend and spouse for all of that time. She, an activist herself, looks with fresh eyes on our rather unique free software world when I need advice and counsel from someone who's not deep in it. A few years ago, I was walking around the house moping because a bunch of people at companies and some people at a, ironically named after the most famous GPL program trade association, really didn't like me. And I felt pretty bad about it. And she said to me, I remember you really like the Michael Moore documentary, Roger and Me. She said, do you think Michael Moore was ever liked by General Motors? Didn't General Motors hate Michael Moore from the moment they learned his name? And don't they still hate him to this day? Furthermore, she said, if you were walking around saying that you were happy that these companies and trade associations liked you so much, you'd then be worried that you had sold out in some way and be moping about that. Her point was quite insightful. When you speak truth to power, the power often doesn't like you. And right now, we are facing a time when software companies have realized that they might be able to defeat us. I will take the advice of the ancient Greeks and not rest on my laurels. I plan to continue my work, particularly for the strategy of copyleft and the GPL. When I installed my first GNU Plus Linux system in the early 1990s, I never would have imagined that by this year, 1 billion devices on the planet would have the kernel name Linux inside them, and that millions upon millions of users would have these devices in their hands and in their homes. However, I would have been deeply disturbed to learn what is also true today. The fact that the GPL is not the magic pixie dust that I thought it was, but instead is something that must be defended, and when not defended adequately, is widely ignored and violated. Users, we all agree, deserve the right to copy and modify and install modified versions of their software on their own devices. Yet companies, many of whom contribute to Linux and other GPL projects, are working to make that not true every single day. The GPL is widely ignored, and they're continuing to recruit former allies of ours to take a position against copyleft who once were for it. My colleagues at the Software Freedom Conservancy and I are committed over the next few years to make a big change to solve this problem. We believe that users deserve the right to reinstall modified versions of their software on their own devices, and we're going to do what it takes to uphold the GPL. We can use your support. Obviously, a financial contribution to Conservancy is nice, but most importantly, be active and out there speaking out about why copyleft matters and is a useful strategy for software freedom. When you hear people saying the license you pick for your project doesn't matter, tell them GPL is a better choice. When you hear people saying it doesn't matter who ends up with the copyrights or what contributor license agreement you have to sign that gives all your rights away and makes the GPL effectively not work, tell them you want the rights in the hands of people who care about software freedom and will uphold a user's right to reinstall their software and modify it on their devices. We all bear a responsibility for the advancement of software freedom. I'm so grateful to get this award. It is painful that we have to make a few enemies among people who want to proprietarize software. But to conclude with the words that Sally Field used when she received her Oscar, I know right now you all like me. You really like me. I know that there are people out there who care about software freedom who are giving me this award. And I thank you for it, and I thank you for recognizing the work that I've done. I remain in service to the cause of software freedom for the rest of my career, and I look forward to working with you all on it. Thank you again so much for this incredibly prestigious and special award.